I believe the X-body cars of 1980 killed General Motors. Now, not immediately, but it set the template for all the problems General Motors had for the next several decades. The 70s and the 80s were very unkind to the American automobile manufacturers, and honestly, the 90s and 2000s weren't much better. Ultimately, Ford survived by mortgaging everything they had. Chrysler ended up declaring bankruptcy and being absorbed into Fiat Chrysler, and GM just declared bankruptcy. But it all started back in the 70s, and I believe the X-body cars kind of personify everything that was wrong and everything that GM could not fix about their culture. So let's roll back the clock a little bit before I get into this, and that is that through the 50s and the 60s, the American manufacturers were preeminent. They had an excellent reputation, reliability, stylish cars. They were producing what Americans believed they still wanted, which was large, luxurious cruisers. But then, in 1973, we had an oil problem, and another one later in the 70s, and to their credit, General Motors leadership recognized what was coming, and they tried to address it aggressively. They began looking at a process to downsize some of their cars, specifically the cars that became the Chevy Citation, the Skyhawk, and the Omega. But let's look back at the beginning of the 70s to see where this all started. In the year before, in 1969, Ford had over 26% of the market share. General Motors had over 45%. Combine that together, you're talking about over 70% of the market between two manufacturers. Now, the next year, in 1970, Volkswagen had their best year ever. I believe that was about 560,000 sales. But you see, they went on a long decline after that. Toyota at the time had 2% of the market, and Honda had 0.04. So the American manufacturers weren't exactly scared of what the imports were bringing to the table, but they certainly saw the writing on the wall, because about 73 there was an oil embargo, and then it happened again later in, I believe, 78, and you saw just a steady decline in their market share over the next several decades. Ford did pretty well, certainly in the 80s and the 90s, on the strength of the Taurus. Now, this was overall a really rough time. Ford survived their debacle with the Pinto, where their cars would randomly explode, and a few dollar part could have fixed it, but court documents showed that they decided, instead of spending the money, they'd rather just litigate and settle. Began to hurt the reputation of the American manufacturers. As the 70s progressed, the imports began to gain a little bit more steam. People began to appreciate them for their careful construction and their good fuel efficiency. Reputations began to change while the Americans continued to have problems with quality and fight a lot of recalls. The 78 oil embargo came around, and to their credit, GM management recognized it and said, we've got to make a change. And they issued a directive, let's say, to create an entirely new car to compete with the imports directly and head on, and I celebrate that. And from a 5,000-foot view, it's a really good idea. But the execution of it was terribly, terribly flawed. Number one, they split the engineering out over several different companies. Pontiac was in charge of the rear suspension, Oldsmobile was in charge of the fuel distribution, Chevy was in charge of the front of it, and if you can imagine how hard it is to develop a car that feels cohesive, imagine doing it with 4 different companies all providing engineering resources to it. When it was finally introduced under a rushed schedule, It was widely acclaimed. Hand-produced cars were provided to journalists to drive, and they loved it. They loved the European styling of it. They loved the handling of it. They really thought there was a winner on their hands, and that they were going to be able to smack the imports right in the mouth before they ever got really a foothold in America. But then reality intruded. It's hard to describe the disappointment that I think that most people felt. Number one, they picked an old engine that was very, very rough. So what they did was they put the engine on very soft mountings to reduce that vibration. The whole engine was mounted on a subframe that was separately assembled and then bolted into the frame of the car. So while the car was rather spacious, it had an unusual interior where like the radio was turned sideways, and that didn't really resonate with many people. But from the engine perspective, reviewers said that it felt a little bit like a semi or a tractor trailer, depending on where you're from, where the engine was doing one thing and kind of pulling the body along behind it, because that's actually what was kind of happening. Sales were strong. General Motors had a hit on their hand. Just for the Citation, they sold over 800,000 in the first year. And then the problem started rolling in. The journalists who were provided with those handcrafted examples got a hold of production models and realized that torque steer was terrible. And torque steer is that feeling you get when you floor it on a front-wheel drive car and the car kind of pulls to the right. Now, the creation of the Citation was to create a unibody, front-engine, front-wheel drive, smaller, compact, very roomy car to compete with the imports. General Motors had created front-wheel drive, front-engine cars before, but they were largely in Cadillacs, big, heavy cars. So producing something that was light and very, very modern for the time was a different creature. I have to take into account that switching from large body-on-frame, front-engine, rear-wheel drive cars to what the Citation became is like doing the moonshot all over again. It is an incredibly difficult procedure. However, a few years later, Toyota did it, and they didn't have a problem with reliability, as an example. So the Citation came out, and reviewers were terribly disappointed. Sales were fantastic, and immediately sales began dropping. Within about 5 years, the car had actually been canceled under a flood of recalls, lawsuits, and ultimately from poor sales. Customers didn't like the weird dashboard with that radio turned sideways, and General Motors decided to go with a notchback instead of a standard four-door sedan like they did on some of the other the other models of it, which meant it looked a little bit weird. But more importantly is the number of recalls that came out. General Motors fought with suspension pieces breaking. Transmission lines would break and cause engine fires. Rust. Most disturbingly, the rear brakes would lock up on even light braking, which would cause the car to spin out of control. This sent multiple complaints to the Transportation Safety Administration. They ultimately filed a lawsuit. General Motors decided that what they were going to do is they were going to issue a recall on a small number of manual transmissions. It didn't actually fix the problem. Court documents said that they could have fixed the problem, but it would have about doubled the price of the rear brake assemblies, and GM decided not to do it. Ultimately, GM won that lawsuit. It was thrown out because the court determined that the Transportation Safety Administration did not follow proper procedures in identifying the problem with the car. But by that point, its reputation had been crushed and the car was off the market entirely. Now that frame, the basic structure, was expanded and used in other cars moving forward, and they never really had this problem with the brake distribution. But poor sales, poor quality, Terrible recalls. Honestly, it didn't handle that well. The engine was rough. It wasn't that fuel efficient. They had a sporty version, which to this day is still pretty well regarded, as a matter of fact. But what should have been a home run, which again at that 50,000 foot level was absolutely what General Motors needed to do, and their management was absolutely on top of it. They rushed engineering, they rushed production, they spread it around, and they produced something that was half-baked. So the whole purpose of this video is, I don't believe the X-body cars were the final nail in the coffin for General Motors, but I do think it produces the blueprint for the coffin for General Motors. When you look at the 80s, at the 90s, even in the 2000s before their bankruptcy, General Motors couldn't seem to do it all right all at the same time. And what I mean by that is maybe they came up with a new platform, but it was late to the market. Think of the Chevy Lumina while the Taurus was out there absolutely killing it in sales. When they finally came out with a good platform, the Chevy Beretta is highly regarded. Honestly, it felt soft and like a boat to me compared to the light and airy Japanese cars. They might stick an old engine in it. General Motors like to use V6s to get the same performance as the 4-cylinders from the imports, but of course they're getting less fuel economy. When they stuck a 4-cylinder in it, it barely was even competitive. When they did design new engines, they tended to have problems with them. Think of the Quad 4 and its head gasket, or even the Saturn engine had the same problem. When they did design a new engine, they would attach it to an old transmission. General Motors was way behind the curve in terms of providing 4 and 5 gears in their automatic transmissions. They just kept making do. So much of what General Motors looked at in the 80s and the 90s and beyond was really good enough. And consumers noticed. And their quality, their reliability continued to take a hit. Their reputation took a hit year after year after year, and they couldn't do it all right at the same time. Even when they had really good cars, like the Cadillac STS. It is a fantastic car. It's large. It's got a great North Star V8, good transmission, handles well, won a ton of awards, and the interior lets it down. And part of that is because of the legacy agreements that General Motors had with the unions. Now, I'm not trying to blame the union for everything here, but General Motors had a fixed cost, which was way above what the imports had to pay. General Motors had to take that money out somewhere, and they took it out of their interiors. Honestly, it's only until very recently that I believe General Motors has finally got all of their act together. I think they are producing very good looking cars with good engines, good transmissions, good handling, good interiors, and are fully competitive in the marketplace. But that X-body car of 1980 kind of set that template for every bad decision they made. They couldn't get it right all at the same time. And the sad part is that management made some good decisions. For example, they foresaw the move to an active sport utility market. They were ahead of the CR-V and the Toyota RAV4, but what they came out with was the Aztek, a hideously ugly machine based on a minivan with a minivan engine and a minivan transmission. Owners love it, but the rest of us can't get past it, and that personifies what General Motors did through the 80s and the 90s. Consider that in 1980 they released the Citation, they sold 800,000, the next year they sold 400,000, and by the next year they dropped down to 100,000, and Chrysler released the K car. That car vaulted them back into profitability. All of its derivatives vaulted them into relevancy again, while General Motors continued to struggle and not be able to put together a quality car that was competitive on the marketplace. This all snowballed finally into when the Great Recession hit. General Motors finally could not endure it anymore. Decades of a vast dealership network and vast marketing could not overcome mediocre products with mediocre interiors, old engines, and old transmissions. So the X-Body, honestly, if I won the lottery, I'd go find one, I'd buy it, and I'd restore it because I think it holds a special place in American automobile history, that it is a great idea, but so poorly executed, it set the template for rushed engineering, bad manufacturing, bad marketing for the next several decades. Leave me your thoughts below.